Sometimes in GM guides and bestiaries, you're given the opportunity to create a monster from random generation tables. Every time I see these, I am immediately intrigued, and I'm always mentally running through the possibilities of different creatures that could be created. It's just a radically different approach to just presenting a pre-statted creature, but it comes with all kinds of implications, as well as some obvious pros and cons. I do need to make a distinction here between randomly created monsters from a sandbox tool versus embedded in a setting. The sandbox randomized monster is fine, but that's not what I want to talk about in this video. You'll find sandbox tools in games like Stars Without Number, where you can spin up literally 10 billion different kinds of alien species and monsters, and in Ben Milton's Knave, where you can roll on massive lists to make any kind of fantasy monster imaginable, or unimaginable if you roll on too many of these tables. These tools are fine, but they aren't creating creatures that fit into a specific setting. What I'm talking about here is randomly created monsters that still retain some intentionality. One great example is the Nameless One generator in the One Ring 2nd edition by Free League. This isn't just a completely random monster. It actually has firm roots in the literature, where characters like Gandalf make references to creatures so horrible and so ancient that he can't even describe them. It's a randomized monster, but it fits the canon. In this video, I want to discuss random monster generation through the context of another example, demons in Forbidden Lands. Just for context, in case you're not familiar with Forbidden Lands, it's a unique, gritty fantasy RPG published by Free League in 2020 and has enjoyed a dedicated following that has led to a number of expansions. In the Game Master's Guide for the game, which details 23 pretty wildly different kinds of fantasy monsters, there are demons, which come in 501,000 variations. In the game's meta story, these demons originated from what appeared to be one, but ended up being several different demon worlds, arriving by way of a so-called proto-nexus into this mortal realm. They infested the lands for a time before being driven back and sealed away, but you will still encounter stray demons here and there who have been left behind. Demons also have two other points of origin. They can be summoned from some unnamed demonic dimension, and they can be the result of a humanoid or an animal corrupted by the essence of demon in the setting, called Mog. So in essence, their randomized nature fits into the setting, and is not just a collection of tables to make a nonsense creature. Although incidentally, the Forbidden Lands core set also does come with a 40-page pamphlet sort of thing that does provide a monster creator section, which does not make any attempt to fit into the setting. This is more of a toolbox for GMs to come up with a random monstrosity of any sort. Again, that's not the kind of random creature I want to discuss here. So let's discuss the pros of a setting-specific random monster generator. Variety. The first and biggest pro is that you can end up with an incredible variety of monsters. In the case of the demons in Forbidden Lands, 501,000 variants is a lot. It really expands on the 22 other monsters included in the Game Master's Guide, at least in some respects. Can reinforce the lore. I can't claim to know why setting creator Eric Granstrom and the writers of Forbidden Lands chose to approach demons as having all these potentially different builds and appearances, but I do know that the modern Judeo-Christian concept of demons is one that depicts them as perversions of the natural order. So to present them as disgusting mutations is pretty much exactly on brand for a demon in a medieval European fantasy-inspired RPG setting. Another perfect setting for randomly created monsters would be an actual mutant-themed RPG like Mutant Year Zero or Mutant Crawl Classics, where the randomness is a feature baked into the soul of the setting. Makes it interesting for the GM. If you take a look at the core bestiary for Forbidden Lands, which is found in the GM's guide, there are only 23 monsters listed. To be fair, you don't just fight monsters in this game, you're also fighting other humanoids, and those include your whole standard spread of core fantasy races. But that being said, if you play this game for long enough, you will exhaust that list of potential enemies. The obvious solution is to publish books with more monsters, which Free League has done again and again for Forbidden Lands, most notably in Book of Beasts. But another solution, which they hit upon right out of the gate, is to include a random creation monster. These can be a huge relief valve for GMs who start to run out of enemies to throw at players. Another great example of this is in Night's Black Agents by Pelgrane Press, where the GM can randomly create the kind of vampire that their players will eventually face off against. In my review of this game, the vampire creation section was one of my favorite parts because it hadn't even dawned on me before then how many different kinds of vampires you could make. It was just exciting from a GM's perspective to consider all the vampire build possibilities. Surprises and challenges players. Randomly created monsters will also titillate players in a couple of ways. First, a novel monster can surprise them, first with the unique appearance and then with the abilities. And that leads to the second, maybe more important feature, which is to challenge the players with ability combinations that they haven't encountered before. Even in games like Forbidden Lands, where you don't always want to choose violence in an encounter, you are pretty often finding yourselves in a fight. And the core experience of that fight, or fight in any RPG, hinges on the abilities of the players and the enemies. When the enemies show up with random abilities, and in the case of Forbidden Lands demons, random weaknesses, the players really have to stay on their toes and pay attention. All right, let's touch on some potential cons and pitfalls of the randomly created monster, and these apply to both setting specific and generic monsters created by rolling on a bunch of tables. Potential imbalanced or nonsensical combinations. I think it's possible to avoid this problem if you keep your rollable tables very short and curated, but even with the 5 modest tables for the demons in Forbidden Lands, each with 11 to 16 entries each, you can definitely end up with some ridiculous demons. For example, you can end up with an unnaturally beautiful goat with tentacles that is immune to weapons and can't stand the sight of children. From a visual perspective, this is awful and actually sort of impossible to even imagine. How can the goat be beautiful but also be so fundamentally nauseating? And then from a mechanical perspective, being immune to weapons is going to nullify at least half of a party's attack abilities, and its weakness at the sight of children is tough because children are tough to produce in the middle of a fight unless you're in a village or something. And I'll be honest with you here, these tables, or any random monster generator tables, are going to give you a lot of trash if you are strict about sticking to your dice results. The trick is to lighten up on the dice a bit. Roll on the tables for sure, but also treat the roll results as suggestions. Let yourself be inspired by all of the options, especially after the first couple of rolls, and then intentionally choose the remaining traits. May require more on-the-spot rulings from the GM. The weirder things get with the mechanical features of a monster, the more edge cases you'll run into when putting them into a game. And when weird things rub up against the rules, there's the dreaded slowdown and potential rules dispute. One example in the case of our demons here is if they possibly have the slimy ability, which allows them to, quote, move through very small openings. Well, what constitutes small? There's no definition of that term in the game. You know, stuff like that. It's hard to assess the impact of this problem at the table. Every table is different. Sometimes you'll have a confident GM who just makes a quick decision about a dispute and players who trust that judgment and follow along. In other cases, you have a more courtroom-like environment where every major rule dispute is litigated between the GM and one or more players. Could slow down gameplay if generated during a session. Personally, I can't imagine a GM just rolling out monsters in the middle of a session to throw at players. Monster generation tables to me seem like GM prep tools to be used before a session. But there are some more intrepid devil-may-care GMs out there who would definitely just roll up a random demon at the table. This could actually lead to a lot of hilarity, but let's face it, that's a lot of dead time for players while a GM reconciles all the tables and puts together a coherent monster. And there are few things worse than dead time at the table. What's the right fit? Chaotic rando monsters definitely have a place in some games, maybe not all games. You have different factors to consider. Let's walk through a working example in order to unpack this. In my own exploration of Forbidden Lands, I've been toying with some homebrew variations on the setting, including a whole new kin called Serpent Kin. They're an ancient race of snake folk that once ruled the continent. Blah, blah, blah. Pretty much the same origin story for every snake folk legend in fantasy RPGs and in real-life conspiracy theories. But as far as how they look in my reconstructed Forbidden Lands, I want them to be randomly generated. Due to the fact that they corrupted themselves millennia ago with evil magic and powerful forgotten technologies, they now appear in many different forms. Factors to consider: game genre and theme. The first thing I'd want to consider here is genre and theme. Do randomly generated serpentkin make sense in Forbidden Lands? Would it be weird for snake-like monstrosities to start appearing out of the ground in Alderland or Devora, enthralling people through serpent magic that's been lost for 300,000 years? This is the most important question, really, and to answer it, you have to look at all the other monsters and kin that have been officially introduced into a game. In the case of Forbidden Lands, the most notable related kin would be the Saurians, an atavistic lizard folk that kind of putts around in swamps here and there. So there is precedent for reptilian kin. The next place to look is the history of the setting. This works out perfectly for me because the setting of Forbidden Lands only stretches back about 3,000 years before things get extremely hazy. Not only that, the history that is detailed within that 3,000 years is cast into doubt due to the intentional implication of an unreliable narrator. Nothing about the stated history could be true at all, and my Serpent Folk's origins go back 100 times further than the oldest of the stated lore. All bets are off in terms of canon. My ancient serpent kin could come out of the ground in any shape and size, and it wouldn't do any offense to the existing lore. Target audience preferences. The next thing to consider is if GMs and players would even want to use randomized serpent folk in their game. Is it something that the community of people playing Forbidden Lands would actually benefit from, as opposed to just one or two pre-statted serpentkin? At the time of recording, the game has 23 monsters from the GM guide, 30 from the Book of Beasts, 8 from Bitter Reach, and 16 from Blood March, with a few more from Raven's Purge, for a total of about 75 or so pre-statted monsters, plus the randomized demons and the random monster generator in the booklet from the core set. Given all this, do players actually need more Forbidden Lands monsters? Not really. The existing monsters and generators cover a lot of ground. Could players use a Serpentkin generator to make 5 or 10 million different snake folk themed creatures complete with their own unique subcultures, serpentine relics, and religious practices? Yeah, sure. I don't think there's any reasonable argument against the notion of adding them to this particular setting. Complexity of the game. The simpler a game's rules, the easier it is to both construct and actually use a randomized monster in an encounter. The reason being, there are just fewer moving parts to a monster's stats. In the case of Forbidden Lands, the game sits pretty much in the middle of the spectrum of complexity, in my opinion, so making a randomized serpentkin shouldn't be a problem. We also already have a couple of official examples of how a randomized monster looks in Forbidden Lands. In the case of demons, they are composed of only 5 tables: their form, ability, attack, special ability, and weakness. In the case of the completely random monster you can make from the Legends and Adventures booklet, you have tables for size, type, limbs, head, tail, armor, movement, home, skills, traits, weaknesses, regular attacks, special attacks, and monster attacks. That seems like a lot, but mechanically, a lot of this stuff doesn't really conflict with each other at all, and each attack is short enough to fit in a single sentence of description. My only worry with trying to create Serpentkin tables is accidentally repeating or imitating the unique attack mechanics already published, both in the tables and in the 75 other pre-statted monsters of the game. Controlling the randomness. I mentioned it earlier about only rolling on a few tables for inspiration before switching over to just cherry picking the features you want for a monster. That should be explicitly stated at the beginning of any randomized monster section. You really probably shouldn't find yourself beholden to the dice for the whole creation process. Your own knowledge about your table, your experience as a GM and a player, and your imagination should always be a critical component in rolling up a random monster. In the example of the demon, the first step is to pick a table, any of the 5, and roll for a random result. Then pick a second table and roll on that. If you have something that inspires you from there, then maybe roll on a third table. Otherwise, just choose items from the remaining tables. You're not breaking any rules by doing this, and frankly, it's just going to result in a better monster faster than if you wrestled with a random nonsense combination. And that's what I would put at the beginning of my Serpentkin tables, a paragraph explaining exactly this. So there you have it, the pros and cons and considerations of setting specific randomized monsters. I'm a huge fan of including them in GM guides and bestiaries, although I don't really see them in games that often. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the randomized demons in Forbidden Lands, as well as setting specific randomized monsters in general. Let me know down below. I've left links for everything. Thanks for watching. See ya.